And joining us now here in studio, Edward Shorter. He is Professor, University of Toronto, and the author of Sadomasochism and Ardent Love, A Reader's Guide to 50 Shades of Grey. Welcome back.
Thank you, Steve.
That's a pretty provocative title. Can I read a little excerpt of 50 Shades before we start here?
Please do.
For those who don't know anything about it. Here we go, folks. Suddenly, he grabs me, tipping me across his lap. With one smooth movement, he angles his body so my torso is resting on the bed beside him. He throws his right leg over both mine and plants his left forearm on the small of my back, holding me down so I cannot move. He places his hand on my naked behind, softly fondling me, stroking around and around with his flat palm. And then his hand is no longer there, and he hits me hard. Okay, you want to give us the Coles Notes on what this book's all about?
Well, this book sounds as though it's all about sadomasochism, and that passage conveys that flavor a little bit, but it's not really. This book is all about a very intense love affair. They are just incandescently in love with each other, and filtering this through the prism of sadomasochism makes it even more intense, because this is the sort of ingenious thing about what is now called a role-playing relationship. There's a complete transfer of control from one.
Edward Shorter, talking about a new book he's written on sadomasochism and sex, on YouTube channel, being asked for his opinions about 50 Shades of Grey, the runaway S&M bestseller. It's a performance that in many regards sums up the nature of Edward Shorter, because there seems to be a contrarian element to his thinking. He strikes me as the kind of person that if you said black, he'd say white. So it comes as no surprise that he took the decision, when entering the realms of the history of psychiatry, to sit down and write a book that explicitly attacked the positions mapped out by individuals like Foucault and particularly Andrew Scull, who really seem to be in Shorter's hair trigger sites. So let's start with the same issue that was explored by Andrew Scull in the last module, the way that the asylums, as fast as they were built, were clogged up, the way that the demand increased exponentially for beds within these institutions. Now, as we saw, Scull explained it explicitly as a result of social and economic processes, in particular the nature of capitalism and industrialization and the demands that it placed upon having a disciplined workforce. So Scull's thinking very much in social and economic terms. Shorter would not have a bar of it. He explicitly played the redistribution from workhouses card. In other words, he said, no, Scull is wrong. There were huge numbers taken from the workhouses and bunged into the new asylums. He then maintained that there had been a huge rise in the number of people experiencing general paralysis of the insane and tabes dorsalis, two conditions that are indicative of tertiary syphilis. And this is part of the clogging up of the institutions. He points as well towards the dangers of alcoholism and how alcoholism may have affected people's brains, resulting in mental incapacity. And finally, and perhaps most controversially of all, he attempts to argue that there was a rapid increase in schizophrenia over the course of the century. In other words, what we're seeing is a very real increase in the number of people that are suffering forms of mental illness, mental distress, madness. Consequently, we have little recourse to economic or social models in terms of trying to explain why there seemed to be this dramatic increase in the numbers of insane during this period. Rather, we can identify specific things, and not just specific things, biological things, because ultimately, for Shorter, biology is behind everything. We are now in a position where we can explore in detail Shorter's agenda, and we can think about how it differs from the position of Scull. First off, Shorter maps out an argument that whenever psychiatry has strayed from the path of biology, that is, whenever it's looked for causes other than biological causes for mental illness, it has gone wrong. Secondly, psychiatry is shaped by its relationship with science. Where social forces impinge, it is usually to the detriment of psychiatry. In fact, it usually makes psychiatry take its eye off the biological ball, makes psychiatry look at other factors which it shouldn't be looking at, because for Shorter, all mental illness is the product of pathological biological processes. There is no room for the psychosocial or psychodynamics here. And this argument is built as a rejection of those individuals that he calls trendy. If you go back to that quote that I highlighted in Lecture 1, where Shorter pointed the fingers at the trendy explanations, you will note that he had a range of different bugbears that he laid open. Capitalism, patriarchy, and even psychiatry itself. These trendy explanations were explicitly pointing to individuals. In the case of capitalism, Scull and Foucault. In the case of patriarchy, scholars like Elaine Showalter, who have traced a special relationship between mental illness, women, and the patriarchal system. And with psychiatry itself, Foucault's probably one of his targets, but he's thinking of anti-psychiatrists like Thomas Satz and R.D. Laing. He is rejecting all of these positions in favour of his biological thesis. Now, increasingly, he is becoming concerned about the relationship between the pharmaceutical industry, psychiatry, and the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This, ironically, or it seems to be ironically, is moving into exactly the same territory that Scull has gone into, making very, very similar arguments. I would suggest, however, that there remains a broad gulf between the two of them. With Scull, he sees the kind of categories that have emerged in the DSM as being the creation of psychiatry, as not representing any form of underlying biology. In the case of Shorter, however, his concern lies in two areas. One is that the pharmaceutical industry, in its greed, has been one of those forces that has moved psychiatry away from its biological focus. The second cause for concern for Shorter is that the DSM's methodology has not been able to identify the biological basis of mental illness, and therefore the methods by which the different conditions have been constructed are the wrong methods and are basically unscientific. So the gulf between the two of them remains huge and still unbridgeable. I would argue that quite clearly what we see in Edward Shorter is a new Whig history, a history that focuses upon progress at the expense of all else. It's very noticeable that when you read the book, people are always passing batons to each other or coming on and off the stage. It's a strange set of metaphors to be using in a history. Most strongly of all, he argues that the Freudian period, the era of psychoanalysis that lasted from the early 20th century right the way through to the 1970s, was a dead end, and it was a hiatus that caused immeasurable damage to the project of psychiatry. Does this mean that we shouldn't take Shorter's history seriously? That's a question that I'm going to leave to you to think about. What I would say is that it's still a very functional history. If you want to know what happened when and where, Shorter really does the business. If you can see past its teleological essence. It's certainly true as well that psychiatrists in particular have been enamoured by Shorter's work. It ties in with their own self-conception, their ideas of what it is that they do in their practice. He has become in some ways the patron saint of progressive biological psychiatrists. So there we have it. Two or three different ways of looking at the history of minds and madness. On the one hand, Foucault, who moves into this post-structural space. On the other, Scull, who appears to be working out of a tradition that mixes Weber with Marx. And then the Shorter, who puts forth the banner for Whig history. Whose history should we go for? Who should we believe? That is a question for us to answer as we move forward through the subject. And that concludes the second online lecture.